Conversation on the interaction of computational and social science called Learning How to Play with the Machines. This is part of a special projects grant through APSA, and this is the first in a series of discussions that will be held between now and spring of 2023. We're meeting first here at the APSA annual meeting, followed by next week a meeting at Johns Hopkins University, in October a meeting at Cornell, co-located with TADA, and then 4 more over the coming year at the University of Michigan, Berkeley, MIT, and again at Johns Hopkins. So today's discussion is going to be very free-form. We'd like to see where the panelists take the discussion, shaped around a few key questions. If the audience has questions they would like to interject as well, by all means, please do. We'll also reserve a bit of time at the end for questions. With that, I'm Arya McCarthy. I'm chairing this alongside Giovanna Dore. We're both of Johns Hopkins University, and Klaus of the London School of Economics. I'll introduce the panelists that we have here today, and then we'll get started. Why don't we go actually in the seating order instead of alphabetically? So Jennifer Pan. At Stanford, Jennifer works on the role of ideas in connecting political elites and the ideologically engaged public.
Wait, that's not me.
I was like, wow, we gotta talk.
Pasting is difficult.
Damn it! I was like, I have a kindred spirit.
I'm so sorry about that. We're off to a good start. So Jennifer is a social scientist by training.
We clone more of you.
She works on the analysis of social media data, text, images, and videos using computational tools. And this has been crucial to her work on media and politics in authoritarian contexts where data that is accessible to independent academics is very limited. Is that the real Jennifer?
Yes.
We got it. All right. Joshua Tucker. Josh at NYU has studied comparative politics.
Is that right?
That is right.
Okay.
So far.
With an emphasis on mass politics and a focus on Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. For the past 10 years, he spent time studying the relationship between social media and politics and how to use social media data to study politics with an eye on the effects of network diversity, on partisan echo chambers, online networks, disinformation and fake news, and Russian bots and trolls. Noah Smith at the University of Washington is a computer scientist working at the junction of natural language processing, machine learning, and computational social science. His research spans core problems in NLP, general-purpose machine learning methods, and a wide range of applications. He began collaborating with social scientists around 2007 and connected with the quantitative text as data part of political science a couple of years after that. He's since graduated 8 PhDs working in this space. Amber Boydstun at the University of California, Davis. Amber's research examines the interaction between media and politics with a focus on, oh, this sounds familiar, how different media portrayals of the same policy issue can prompt citizens and policymakers to respond to that issue in different ways. She uses lab experiments, large-scale media studies, and manual and computational text analysis to study how issues make the news and the dynamics of media storms. And finally, Justin Gross. At the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Justin works on methodological problems in measurement, text analysis, and network analysis. His special interest is methods that put statistical and computational tools to use to achieve rich qualitative insights. His current projects focus on how media activists and politicians, in other words, opinion elites, invoke core values in order to frame arguments while at times contesting the very meanings and appropriate application of these values, and examines the processes by which extreme ideas may move from the fringe to the mainstream in contemporary US political discussion. So with that, thank you all for being here today. We'll start by asking, how have the past 15 years of interaction between machine learning, natural language processing, and the social sciences led to new directions and better work in the former on issues like ethics, data quality, and methodology? Anyone, please feel free to take it away.
Like our CS colleague. that question, right?
So I guess as the token computer scientist, I would at a high level say that we talk a lot about, when I'm in these circles, about importing techniques and methods from natural language processing, machine learning, into political science and other social sciences, but it's actually worked quite a bit in the other direction as well. Computer scientists, by and large, with one major exception I'll mention, are not that interested in studying people. The one exception, of course, is the subfield of human-computer interaction, which does a lot of user studies and is really interested in human psychology and how humans can interact with machines. But most of the rest of computer science is just not very human-oriented. And I think since we've seen this kind of growth in computational social science, some people call it data science, this kind of overlap, we've seen a lot of ideas and techniques go the other direction as well. So it's not, we now, at the natural language processing conferences, we now have whole tracks on questions of ethics, on applications that relate to politics and other social sciences. It's become pretty mainstream. And I think a lot of the methodological training that goes into a PhD in political science is now, we're starting to see evidence that computer scientists are catching on. I used to joke that the political scientists were way better at statistics than we were.
We are.
On average, you are. We're really good at modeling. We're really good at math, but in terms of like knowing statistical methods that are suitable and what kinds of inferences you can make, my political science collaborators have always known more than I have. It makes me wonder why we're even there sometimes. But computation is a different thing than statistics. But yeah, I think the amount of sort of social science work that I see in computer science now has gone up tremendously, and I think it's in part because of these cross-disciplinary interactions that we've started. I mean, computing has become more important in society, pushing us to ask these questions, but we're also better equipped to try to answer them because of the interactions we've had over the past 15 years. Please.
I think it's also not just been a transference of methods, but my sense when I got into this shared space around the same time that Noah did, is that at the far extreme, computer scientists cared about improving the most recent tool. That if the most recent tool was 35% accurate and you could build a tool that was 36% accurate, then you were winning at life. And what we brought to the table, I hope, is the sense that we also care about the accuracy, right? We care about the truth of the answer because we're asking questions that involve human beings. And when you're asking those kinds of questions, we could argue lots of kinds of questions, then 36% accuracy is not high enough. And I think it's been nice for social scientists in this field to be able to have a better sense of all the tools that are available to us and a different lens through which to see those tools. And it seems to me like at these shared conferences, I've seen a real, not just an understanding, but really an embrace of the importance of those human-based questions. Is that your sense?
Yeah.
So would you say then that there has been this benefit to computer science of seeing things from the social science perspective, getting value from what sort of things have you seen in your collaborations where, for instance, computer science has seen things in a different way because of what you brought to the table?
So I think, again, I want to be careful not to sort of ignore what's been happening for many decades in HCI, in human-computer interaction, right? But in the sort of machine learning AI part of computer science, what I'm seeing is significantly more interest in graduate students being able to talk across disciplines, being able to get jobs in maybe slightly more interdisciplinary departments like iSchools, and much more kind of openness on the hiring side to people who bill themselves as computational social scientists. I remember 10 years ago trying to explain to hardcore machine learning people what that even was, right? And now people are getting jobs in strong departments. That's huge. Like for the computer science establishment to have said, okay, yes, we will hire tenure track faculty who use these words. That's a sign that something has changed.
So, yeah, I hope I didn't set
to how I was going to say, when you talked about political scientists being good, having good statistics, it probably didn't hurt that one of the first political scientists you worked with had a PhD in statistics, but I've certainly found that the case that the statistical strength, and I think that the statistical and machine learning background of political scientists is getting stronger through the collaborations. One thing from the political science perspective, I'll say that I've noticed changing, and I don't know what the causal story is here, it's probably in part through collaborations, was when I started, well, not to get too far off track, but one of the challenges is that so much of the space of computational social science is involves multiple methods. So just as an example, how I wound up getting interested in, and I'm by no means an expert in, but collaborating with folks in NLP, in natural language programming, was because I was at a job where a bunch of us were working on a problem that in network analysis, we really wanted to look at the flow of ideas. We wanted to look at essentially the blogosphere as it was then, and trace spread of ideology, spread of essentially ideas, and all of us at the table, and we were multidisciplinary, so we had a mathematician, we had a statistician, we had someone doing computer science, we had public policy, we had political science, sociology. All of us had training more in social network analysis. None of us were in text analysis. And so we're like, oh, okay, we've got so many, you do dynamic models of networks, and I do these, old school sociological, and then we got there and like, oh, okay, well, I'm, acting like it's trivial to just measure ideas, right? Like, well, what words represent those ideas? Like, oh, actually, people have thought about this more carefully. Oh, there's a whole science to this. And my original point was just that when I got started sort of looking for solutions or strategies for dealing with language as data, essentially. One of the challenges I found in my early interactions with and reading up on some of the tools that were there 15 years ago, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense of the sort of the development of the field was so much driven by information retrieval and really the problem, where's the money, right? So much of the science had grown up to answer questions posed essentially by Google or Alta Vista before that, right? And so, and as a teacher of some, trying to teach students about some of these things, it's still like this idea, even just within NLP, that it's not just like, oh, what do people use for text? Oh, it's called latent Dirichlet allocation. No, what's the question, right? And it's not necessarily the same answer if you want to know, hey, how do I get a document that's on the subject that I'm thinking about versus how do I put two people in classifications based on the kinds of ideas that they're using? And I think that's, I've seen some development, not as far as I'd like, but away from everything being driven by getting back to the 36, 37%, like how good are we at getting doing search, but actually being driven in some cases by theoretical questions.
Yeah, so I'll just add a couple things on this. One is, it's interesting. So my lab, which is now called the Center for Social Media and Politics, CSMAP at NYU. It was previously known as the SMAP lab before that. The whole reason it started was that I got interested in trying to understand the impact of social media on some stuff that was going on in Russia. And I tried to start looking around at literature on what was out there on social media and politics. And this was back in 2011. So this had to do with electoral fraud in Duma elections following what was known as the colored revolutions throughout Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. And it seemed to me in that first brief literature review that everything that was out there was being written about politics by astronomers and physicists and network scientists and computer scientists. It wasn't even just computer scientists, but there was so little by political scientists. And so not surprisingly, that literature was utterly devoid of any theoretical conception of how politics worked. It seemed to be people who had great knowledge about networks or data or these sorts of tools who suddenly saw there was new data out there. And the whole reason like the lab and all the people who worked with it exists in the first place is that we went to the NSF and we basically said, hey, look, there are these incredible tools out there. They seem to be being used by people who don't know anything about social science theory. What if we took people who were being trained as social scientists and tried to teach them how to use these tools? And so that was, so from Noah's point to hear like the way that this is developed and that people are saying that, but like that literature looked utterly foreign to me as a political scientist, and yet I was completely and utterly intrigued by what was going on there. I also want to make sure that we give just huge kudos. I mean, we're talking about like what this has done flowing back to computer science, but what this did for political science, like, and what it did for the study of politics, right? Simply opening up text to quantitative analysis, right? This TADA or Texas data as we're talking about here.
I like saying it ta-da.
Ta-da, right? Ta-da, right. I mean, I remember, I think Gary King wrote about this originally, right? Like if you thought of that all that we were able to do in political science before with quantitative analysis were things that had numbers on them, once you start making text into data, it like increased it 100-fold, 1,000-fold of what we had open for us, right? The study of network analysis, being able to study networks at scale, it's completely changed what we can do with network analysis. So I think there are huge benefits of the flow in the opposite direction. I don't want that to get lost in this conversation. But I still do think, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned like you're so excited that your students can get computational social science jobs at iSchools, right, or in computer science. Like, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wow, like, iSchools, I didn't even know they existed. And this is a place where students who kind of come through our lab doing this kind of computational social science, or comms, like Jen's in a comms department, like that there are all these sort of other things that are open as opportunities for this. But I still think that there are important differences kind of in incentives. Like I still feel like when I work with computer scientists, there still is, so there's the 36%, 37% accuracy, there's also the how many milliseconds can you shave off, how fast it was done afterwards. And so I still think there are these very differing types of incentives out there. So I don't want to over that. And like we've been, Patrick, who's in our lab, who's a postdoc in our lab, and I, we were just dealing with an R&R that Patrick had gotten at a computer science conference proceedings, and it was like a totally different process that we were completely used to. So I think there's still a lot to be gone, and I think it's super exciting because we talk about it as like, in my field, we talk about this emergence of this new field, which we're loosely digital democracy or digital autocracy or digital politics or whatever you want to call it. But that's just a subset of these larger, all these different ways where people are dealing with these collaborations across the machine learning and computer science and what we're doing in the social sciences. But there's still, and I know we'll talk about this later in the discussion, I think there's still a lot of challenges there in terms of the way that researchers are incentivized. And that's why the iSchool sort of excites, every time I feel like there's a place where it draws from both of these things, but is able to recognize and reward the things out there, I think that's really valuable for collaboration. I sometimes am nervous that the discipline system that we have in academia is very, very slow to evolve, and this is a sort of newly evolving field, and I don't know necessarily how well it all fits together some of the time.
Right, and Jen, you were nodding along to that. What do you see here?
I mean, I think there are a lot of different threads here. First, I will say that my career probably wouldn't have started without Texas data. So I was at Harvard starting in 2009, and that was the beginning of the wave of interest in text. If I'd gone 3 years before, I would have done matching. But because I started in the late 2000s, it was text. And as someone who studies primarily Chinese politics and politics in non-democratic countries where data is very limited, with these methods and the fact of the internet and digital social media, it opened up whole new arenas for research. But then I realized actually political science still cares a lot about causal inference and primarily about causal inference, and these descriptive methods have some limits. But I would say still, even now, the data, non-structured, high-dimensional data, as well as methods coming from computer science, NLP, machine learning, have been really crucial to enabling the types of research that I'm able to do. I think we'll get to the difficulties and challenges of collaboration later on, but those are absolutely still there. But I think there's a lot more cross-fertilization. I see this with my PhD students in social sciences who may not collaborate or write papers with CS PhD students, but they're talking to each other a lot. And that informal kind of interaction sometimes is very helpful to stimulating research.
Can I just
Go ahead.
just want to add that you're so right, Jen, that political scientists, we care quite appropriately about causal inference, and that's meant that historically it's just really hard if you have descriptive data, no matter how meaningful and important it is to document, it's just really hard to get it published. And one of the things that these new methods in text as data has done for us, I think, is that if you have a fancy method, it seems to me, if you have a fancy method and you have descriptive findings, you're more likely to get it published. And that's, so we can talk about that, but the end result, I think, is that political scientists have become more, I think as a community, we've remembered how important descriptive findings can be.
I was going to point out that we're starting now to see a surge in interest. Maybe it's a little bit niche still, but in NLP, there's now a workshop on causal inference. I actually have a postdoc who wants to figure out whether causal inference is going to be useful in NLP. Maybe not for social science type applications, but more because the models we have today are so inscrutable that we have to use social science methods to attempt, and psycholinguistic methods and so on, to try to understand what the hell they're doing. But things are flowing in that direction, and I think that pathway, a lot of the people who were involved in that conversation were connected to text as data and were influenced by the, let's call it causality fixation that you have in political science. I'm still unsold myself. I don't know.
Oh, but that's the holy grail. If you can prove that goes in one direction only, everybody's really happy. The problem in social science in general is that
It's a myth.
it goes both directions if it does.
Upside down, turns every direction. This is actually a good opportunity for a segue to another question then, which is, we have sometimes these difficulties with like computational approaches to, for instance, descriptive inference. So in real-world settings with real-world data, what limitations have you seen in automatic analysis, whether it's causal inference or something else? When do you go automatic versus manual? When do you go qualitative versus quantitative?
Or even worse, when do you mix them so that they make sense together? Which is something that neither publication or either side likes when they're mixed. So.
I mean, I'll start on this one. Yeah, so I was a little perplexed by the question because I actually, and I'll explain why. And this is something when I sort of teach on this stuff, I think about it this way, and maybe people think about it differently. I actually feel like we, in political science, as we went into sort of quantitative analysis, and quantitative analysis in political science before this kind of larger computational social science or ML revolution that we want to talk about, was mainly stuff you could put on a spreadsheet, right? And it would fit into a spreadsheet. But I felt like nobody ever read those spreadsheets. Like you never said to your student, go back and like spend a good hour or two poring over the inside of your spreadsheet and looking at the numbers at it. Like you might say do diagnostics, do some things to make sure it doesn't make sense. But when I actually felt like the machine learning revolution has actually brought qualitative work back into the study of quantitative social science. Because when we're doing supervised machine learning models, there's a huge part of it, which is like building the training data set is essentially a qualitative enterprise where we're working on code books and we're working on definitions and can we get coders to agree on these definitions. And even when you're using unsupervised machine learning models, right, like you're constantly looking at the output of them to figure out. I mean, that's one of the things that we actually think is one of the shortcomings right now. It's still like unsupervised machine learning models, like this art as opposed to a science, like of how do you set the number of topics and these kinds of things. And so, to me, I feel like, and then meanwhile, I feel like this kind of qualitative step is built into the guts of the thing, at least as we tend to use it in social science. Because if you think about the way that we always have to talk about machine learning models, we're constantly talking about precision and recall, which is essentially saying like, okay, let's look at this thing that predicted these tweets should be about foreign policy. We have to have a measure of how many of those tweets were actually about foreign policy to get our precision and to get our recall statistics. And that goes back to the original step of how we trained the model in the first place, but the holdout data, so I kind of feel like it's built into the guts of it. Like, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's more built in than in the first part of my career where I was just dealing with like large spreadsheets that came out of surveys When I didn't sit down and read what was in the spreadsheets, only when something went wrong did I go in and be like, oh, why are there a whole bunch of -9s in there? Like, I didn't realize.
Tables.
Yeah,
with
exactly.
A lot of numbers that means nothing.
And so, but then the other thing I do want to just note, right, is that like, when you do say, can you go qualitative? I mean, one of the things that this computational social science revolution has allowed us to do is to do research, even just purely descriptive research, on things that you can't go qualitative on, right? Like we have a paper we recently published in the QJPS, Political Science Journal, which was drawn from 1.2 billion tweets looking at hate speech, the prevalence of hate speech on Twitter over the course of the Trump campaign and the beginning of his presidency, right? Like there's just no way to do that. You have to have machines read 1.2 billion tweets. There aren't enough undergraduate research associates to read 1.2 million, let alone 1, 2 billion.
Therapy.
Right, exactly. Well, that's a whole other matter. But yet, even that project where we were heavily dependent on machines, it was a project that could only be done in a machine-driven or in a machine world. We still hand-coded 24,000 of those things, and with the therapy point noted on it, it was not a high point of anyone's day to be doing that kind of stuff. But you know, it still had a very qualitative component to it. So I actually feel like in political science, we're in a place where these things are melding a little bit more than they were previously for those of us who primarily do quantitative research.
I think that's right. I would call that, I mean, the hand coding, right, is still quantitative. It's just not computational, right? But it's
Qualitative, you're reading. You're actually reading stuff and
That's
interpreting
true. You're
it.
reading,
Yeah.
but you're putting numbers to it,
Mhm.
right?
It's
Yeah.
a distillation.
But in any case, I think you're exactly right. But what you're doing in your lab, Josh, right, that's the gold standard of what we want people to be doing. And because the question was about challenges, I do have this deep worry that because there's a very small number of reviewers who have the methods training and the theory background to be able to, review pieces like this, that at least I've seen it come across my desk, a number of other papers from, other places where they don't do the testing against manual data, whether we're gonna call it qualitative or quantitative, and sometimes they get through, right? And I think they get through because it's fancy methods, and if you don't have the sophistication to evaluate it, then you're just gonna trust it, right? And so this part does make me nervous that the question, I mean, there are some questions where I think it's totally appropriate to use topic modeling, to not rely, other than the kind of sniff test on a training data set. But in general, I think we're still at the point, and maybe Noah can correct me, but I think we're still at the point in computer science where we need to have such clarity about the theoretical question that we're asking, that if we had the money to pay for the therapy, that humans could agree on the thing that we're looking at. And there are lots of questions that could be asked where that training data set is really hard to get in the first place because the concept itself is so fuzzy. And so if you don't have the validation against that human coding, then we can be making the wrong inferences, right? And that makes me scared.
And if I can build on what Amber is saying in terms of the papers that come across as simply of the fancy method. We have seen so many that they tell you the method and then they describe what they found and there is no explanation of what that means. So it's so often the combination of those two that then you go back and say, what is the question that was asked? What is the meaning of what you had done? There is a huge component of qualitative in the way that Josh was describing. But I think that for making these methods even more relevant, to go beyond the 36 or whatever percentage, trying to show off as much as possible what it means to have access and to use it in that way, it's still missing a little bit unless it comes out for a few places or for few individuals that actually work in collaboration, that it becomes normal for that to see. So I've seen a lot of what actually Amber is mentioning, and I see that as a challenge very much as well.
So I just want to jump in and point out that your numbers are out of date. We're not at 37. We're now at about 93.
Okay.
And pretty soon pretty soon the models are going to understand everything, and all you'll have to do is tell it in English what you want and get the answer, if you believe what you're reading in the news.
I'm actually an AI.
But that's great, because finally we will have the cushy life of academia. If it gets 100%.
It'll all be easy. But I think we are very seriously in danger of people, even more than they have in the past, finding it easy to believe that the systems are incredibly smart and can do all kinds of things that, both because they do things that are impressive and surprising, and because there are people who have a lot to gain by telling us that they're more impressive than they actually are. So there's a lot of hype around AI. When we started talking, you never heard me use the term AI because we didn't use that word back then, but now it's come back. And it's misleading. And so I think the danger that people will trust these methods more than they should is at an all-time high. Because they give the appearance of trustworthiness on so many other things, and we as humans tend to ascribe human qualities to a thing that talks like a human, and then assume that those capabilities transfer to other things that humans can do. So, huge warning, whenever I go to these kinds of mixer meetings, it's like, don't trust any of the things that you read about these models. They're still crappy. We're still maybe at 38, I don't know.
Very impressive, very impressive.
Sorry.
I was going to say, I'm not as worried in the sense that I think this is an issue that is being identified, like Jacob Montgomery and Brendan Stewart's paper about use of topic models in political science. First of all, there are actually not that many papers in top journals that use these methods, and I actually have seen many papers rejected. So we don't really know what the denominator necessarily is, but I think there's increasing awareness of that. I do think, though, with deep learning, it's sometimes even harder to try to describe what is going on. For example, right now we have a project looking at video similarity, and we're using tools that computer scientists have developed, and we're trying to understand them more deeply, but they're not really interested in explaining them.
They can't.
Yeah,
There is no explanation.
They can explain.
It's huge matrices being multiplied together many, many times. There is no explanation.
That is an explanation.
So, but I think there's actually something, at least in a lot of the research kind of paradigm that I've been trained in, it ends up being that we're using fully automated methods like unsupervised machine learning for theory generation and exploration, along with purely qualitative methods like reading or watching. And once we generate an idea, then we're using maybe supervised machine learning or actually experiments to then say something. And that second step is in the research design where we're kind of vulnerable to being proven wrong. So there's some element of falsifiability in that process. And in the textbook that Justin Grimmer, Molly Roberts, and Brendan Stewart are putting together, I think that kind of mentality of approach is something that they also suggest.
Yeah,
I just brought that book to hold up.
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of reading that book this spring, and it's really a phenomenal book. And they do such a nice job not only of kind of giving the history and the background of how we've gotten to this place, but also just being really smart at talking about the ethics of the approach and all this kind of safeguarding that.
I was just going to say quickly that I've kind of, full disclosure, I feel like I've kind of had a sort of reverse trajectory from starting in a world of statistics and then like doing work with computer scientists and being dissatisfied in some level, or myself kind of going through the like idealist, like, oh, we can't do the things that I really want, to trying to get back to first principles, to going to like basic content analysis, see like what would be going on here if I were doing this, and appreciating a lot of the virtues of more qualitative or quantitative content analysis, and thinking just about social science measurement of concepts and conceptualization itself. I find as a teacher we have a recent at UMass, this data analytics and computational social science masters program that started a couple of years ago and kind of brings people across social sciences and computer science and stats. And I find this a constant challenge. I find in a lot of ways having students come to me, whether undergrads or graduate students, being like, great, I have this question, and I know that we can use like NLP for it now, and this kind of, you know, wide-eyed like optimism, and I would say 9 times out, probably 10 times out of 10, I'm like, no, it can't do what you think it can do. Like, and frankly, you know, and trying to kind of keep them with a foot in both spaces and not be like, I just need to learn enough computer science so that I can ask the computer, oh computer, sort these tweets into the ones that are populist, you know, and wave a wand, and like, you know, and so I think I try to be also, and then this is why I like that book, but that was just mentioned, that you're trying to maintain a certain humility with tools and not be like what we're pushing for and that we're, God forbid, like, that we're there already, is the ability to say, computer, here's my question, now you tell me the answer, like in Willy Wonka, it's gonna tell you where the candy bar is.
So I guess a question that I would have in that area is that given that there are limitations to what you can model computationally, you might want to step in and say, look, I will just read the damn thing myself, do some coding, do some annotation. What sort of things can I pull out of this that maybe I either don't have the training data that I need to fit a supervised model for this or something in that vein? Where do you go when you want to do something beyond what the computer can do that you feel is something that would integrate into the question that you're trying to answer?
The magic wand comes to mind.
I mean, the short answer to that is get the training data. Like, you know, I mean, and so, and I say that not facetiously, like there's 2 ways to think about that. Like one is on an individual level. Like we always think about I mean, like, you know, coming from studying in post-communist countries, like, you know, like there was data you could get, and in Jen's case, data you couldn't get. And you can't will the data that you want into just because you have a project you want to do. So on the supervised machine learning thing, like, yeah, I think it's super important that we think about, I mean, I'm flattered, Amber, that you said it was the gold standard, like, but like, I don't think of it that way. I think of it as like, if you're gonna do supervised machine learning, you need training data to train your models on. And most of the time, the training data that's sitting around is not the one that political scientists need. So that's on an individual level. But I think we wanna think about this much larger on a sort of, on an institutional level or on a discipline-wide level and a field-wide level, which is we need access to more data and we need to think about how to solve economies of scale problems. Like there are things that we can do in CSMAP with the budget we have and the people that we have that you just cannot do if you're a PhD student getting excited about this at a department where you maybe have one faculty member who can teach you computational social science but isn't working in your subfield that you're interested in. And here I think there are opportunities now to solve these kind of things on economies of scale. I mean, there are informal networks going around where we pass training data to each other. That's not organized optimally yet. That's probably 90% the rich getting richer because you know the right people to talk to, right? But that's something that you could imagine being set up. Now, then there's huge questions about training data needed being updated. Like some of the work that we've done on Russian bots, we found that our training data, you know, we did a huge thing where we looked at what we had trained on 2014 and saw if it worked for 2015. We were surprised. It worked pretty well for 2015. We then took that model and applied it to the US in 2016, and it was horrible, even though it had nothing to do with text. It was just dealing with metadata. And so we had to start the whole process again. I have a project on Russian bots in the 2016 election that's like 3 years behind schedule because we had to rebuild our training data set, which was an extensive thing because we couldn't use it to transfer there. So there's clearly economies of scale that can be built on this, and this has been something that I've been interested in for many years. Which is getting some momentum in a couple places now, finally, which is having kind of third-party institutes that exist to solve some of the problems. Now, normally we talk about it in terms of like data acquisition and data access, but these kinds of things are like almost kind of like low-hanging fruit. Like imagine there was a third-party institute that was dealing with getting data, in my case what I'm interested in is out of the platforms, but you could imagine it for other things that people are interested in, that was also building tools but also served as a repository of training data sets. And and maybe it's that training data needs to be updated, that hate speech, that all this stuff that we had hand-coded for hate speech in 2016 is not exactly right now, but it's a good place to start, and you might be able to just add a little bit to it in these particular goals. And Patrick, to tout some of Patrick's work, right? Like one of the things that we're working on here is trying to come up with methods where you can do this kind of training with much smaller corpuses of training data to be able to do this. So I think we want to think about it as a field, and we want to think about it institutionally in that regard. But I also think we want to be modest, right? There are projects we can't do because we don't actually have the data that we can do that. And that, I think, gets back to Amber's point, right? Which is that we do, and it sounds great about the text, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I think we do want to really have clear blinders on people where we say, like, you know, this is not what's possible with these types of approaches, and this is what you need to take these next steps, and these are the kind of resources, and maybe we can try to think systematically about ways to make that easy. But I think if the point is you need training data, you need training data.
So a limitation there, right, is that sometimes the phenomenon that you're looking into is maybe too subtle, right? It's difficult to model, especially with, like, is there some strategic ambiguity that's taking place in this headline? You know, is a particular subject, you know, being reframed progressively?
So I'll let other people talk, but I'll just give one example of this. So the paper that we're going to present on Sunday, we've been working for a while. There was this paper that a bunch of us did in Science where we put forward this idea called political sectarianism that was supposed to be like a kind of a form of affective polarization that was a little more clearly defined. And it had these three components to it: aversion towards the other party, moralization, and othering. Right? And so we've set out in the lab to write a classifier that picks up on all of these. But we are having so much, so the aversion one's good. We have a good aversion classifier now. The aversion piece of it is really good. And we have had so much difficulty trying to get on the othering part of it. That's the hardest one. Even human coders to agree.
Because the human coders
Exactly.
don't agree on that part,
So I mean, at some point you come to
we have seen something similar on headlines. That if they're good ones, they're too short for anything machine sort of like done. And then when you move to the human coding, there are a lot of other issues that come to mind. So.
But I think if we're talking about supervised methods where you have a training data set, the problems is not on the machine side,
Right.
it's on the human side that we can't agree on the conceptualization and operationalization of a concept that is tricky or nuanced. And usually though, if you can agree and you have high intercoder reliability, then on the machine side it's fine. So it's not, to me, it's not a kind of computational issue, it's a human conceptualization and theory issue.
So I think, I mean, you know more, you've done this a lot more than I have, Jen, but it does seem like there are probably some cases that fall into that latter camp. So in the majority of cases, if the humans can agree, then we can get the machine right up to way above 36%. But I think that there are cases, I'm thinking of humor in particular, and so I didn't go too far down this road, but I worked with some computer scientists trying to use a training data set for supervised learning to identify humor, and it was just we hit roadblocks so fast, so quickly that we just stopped.
Is this because the computer scientists couldn't understand?
That is very funny. But why was it funny? So that might be, I mean, that's a niche case, but my guess is that, maybe it really is just humor, and maybe we didn't go far enough, and probably if I handed the training data to you, you would be able to.
I don't know, but still I would say humor is dependent on your cultural context, you as an individual.
Fair. Yeah, no, that's
and
fair.
similarly, I think there are other things like that, like deception. What is deception?
Yeah.
And yeah.
I think this comes up more. I'm not as confident in machine learning as you are. I think part of it is so I'll give you an example. In addition, I think humor is like a quintessential sarcasm, quintessential example, right? But even something, that I am optimistic on, and I think that we'll get there, but was challenging even with really good colleagues in NLP and good grad students trying to work on this. The question that has been like dogging me for several years in trying to create kind of classifiers that can deal with is there's something that comes up for me in the study of ideologies, which is part of the problem is this, like, it's really easy in lots of different ways to figure out who is basically left, who's basically right by their own accounts. But in in terms of sort of subtle categories, in terms of, I'll give you a quick example. The key thing is they're using a lot of, they're using a lot of the language, they're throwing each other's language at each other, right? And that is, so I think of it, I refer to it when I'm having human coders. Okay, when they talk, this person talked about social justice, did they do so dismissively or sincerely? All right, for a long time if someone said social justice, you could say, oh, not only are they left of center in the US context, but they're leftist. Now you know they're either leftist, not liberal, center, left, or right, or far right, because they're talking about social justice words. Now there are some cases there where, like, if they say social justice, if they put it in quotes, right? I think a fundamental problem is that some of the signals that humans can pick up on, so my human coders can pick up on this, oh, not always, but often, oh, they're throwing the words, they didn't put quotes on it, but they said, this is the kind of thing the other people believe and that are so stupid, but they're not saying, they're not putting any clear markers on it, and you have to get it from broader context. I think it's a high dimensionality problem, right? Like if you think about the things we do best at in NLP, or at least the kind of subset of NLP that we're using more heavily in computer and political science, where there's in the presence of certain words or certain engrams, certain small phrases, you can be pretty confident that a certain concept is there. The difficulties are more in there's several different ways to express it, and it's not just like, was this term, even in higher dimensions of like how many words, it's something subtle in the one of a number of words was modifying or was sending a subtle signal that a human could pick up, oh, you're not being serious, you're finding fault, but you didn't use any of our, it's not clear, even if you ask the human coder, how did you know that person thinks social justice is stupid? Well, I don't know, because of some of the other things they said, and I could tell that anyone who believed that doesn't really believe in social justice, so they must have been sarcastic, which is kind of a near neighbor of humor. So I find myself in this kind of this challenge of what is it, and one thing we don't do a lot of that's really challenging that some NLP computational linguistics work on is, okay, is there something about the modifiers, is there something about the structure of the sentence that maybe could signal in ways that words can't? And I think that's possibly an area of growth.
So do you mind if we move then to a more meta level question? So there are three questions that we've written about that characterize the interaction of computational and social science. These are theory versus big data, and these are points that have come up intermittently throughout the discussion already. Theory versus big data, praxis versus substance, and prediction versus explanation. How important is 35 versus 36, and what do you get out of that? So what do you see about the interplay of these opposites in shaping the field, and what moves the conversation forward?
The reason why we're asking this question is because we were recently at a conference presenting and describing some of this, and almost inevitably everybody that stopped by to ask questions was, why are you guys even here with these questions? So it would be interesting to get your take on the interaction of these three different set of questions.
I would say those are really big questions.
Oh yeah.
Of course.
And you're the right people to answer.
I would say the contrasts oftentimes move the conversation forward, and it's about bringing people together who are coming from different areas, but know enough about the others to actually have a conversation, to be able to understand or learn about what each other is saying. Mm-hmm. If it's too divergent, then everyone's going to talk past each other, and sometimes that happens. Right. But I think having some overlap it is important to moving things forward. Although I think on the prediction explanation side, that's I think been, I have one paper that's co-authored with computer scientists, and I think that paper, we'll talk about failures later. No one was really happy with that paper, got a lot out of that paper. And I think that, and I'm at Stanford, and there's amazing people who are doing amazing work in NLP and machine learning, and I think one of the big divergences is that what computer scientists are trying to do is different than what I'm trying to do as a social scientist, fundamentally. Mm-hmm. So as a social scientist, I'm trying to answer questions about how the world works what is happening, what causes what. I have a very good friend in CS who does reinforcement learning, and her work assumes there's a behavior that we want, and figures out how do we use data efficiently to make predictions. But as a social scientist, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out what the state of the world is. I'm not doing things that are normative about what things should be. And so this fundamental starting point is very, very different. And so I think that limits kind of the co-authoring collaborations, but that doesn't mean that kind of her work on reinforcement learning is not going to be potentially helpful somewhere down the line or inspire some grad student who's working in social science.
I'll say I just got through, this is probably a thing that I've thought about this more than any, I just got through teaching, kind of developing and being, teaching a new course for master's and PhD students on machine learning for social science, and I used as kind of a core text the kind of, not an introduction to statistical learning, not elements, but the sort of, in R, kind of focused in R. And I like that they talk in sort of different dimensions, and one of them they talk about is like prediction versus explanation. And one thing that I found is, even just coming in, I would say we are much more in social sciences on the explanation side of things, and computer scientists, or I would say, there's more of an emphasis on prediction. There's a misunderstanding, I'll say, coming into a new department where I joined several years ago that had folks who were just generally, some folks who were very hostile to any kind of quantitative work. There was a misunderstanding, I think, on their part that like, it was sort of in 2016, like, oh, if you're so good, why didn't you predict Trump winning? And I was like, that's not, I think part of the problem is the kind of predictions, you're like, why didn't you predict the Soviet Union falling? Like, those kinds of predictions are like, I'm not trying to do that in large part because they're the result of chaotic interdependence, and the statistical tools are good at sort of giving a summary of things, but not of, those sort of confluence of millions of different causes and whether it goes one way or another. But that's not to say that we're not interested in prediction, right? And so what I tell my students, most of the questions they have are explanatory in nature. If they're building models to help understand them, they can't say, well, I don't care how well this model predicts. What they care about, and I'm not someone who's like, well, I think most folks know, it's not, by the time you do your PhD, it's not necessarily about like, I found the right model any more than like, oh, I proved that this process is an example of a regression, right? Like that's not, but what you want is, right, so then if you have a certain model and you're like, well, I took my best fit of this, nomial blah, 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 or this event, this hazard model, then you want to know that your best model that you're then gonna try to interpret coefficients and parameters off of is good enough, right? And so that you can interpret it. So you want to do these explanations. You want to use some things that were estimated. You want to make sure that they correspond to something real, the relationship between some variables that you've explained well. And so the prediction, really post-diction, like is it handling for me in machine learning, the big positive, the big value added for these students, why do machine learning at all if that's not really what we're up to, is there are a lot of, is emphasis on things like validation, cross-validation, training and test, and that sort of thing, from the point of view that then you can go, here's why I'm confident now, moving to really kind of almost more of an interpretive level, which is like, here's the story that this model that has been best fit tells me, and you say, okay, but is that really a 7? Do you know it's not an 11? Yeah, because it predicted the data well enough internally. It doesn't mean that I'm going to make a lot of money in the stock market necessarily, but it means that I have confidence in the story I'm telling you based on the estimates of these coefficients. But it's also the reason, the fact that we're more explanatory is the reason that I said, here's what deep learning is about and why I'm not really teaching you much about it. For the kinds of explanations, I think that the places where things like deep learning or serious, like certain really hidden kind of black box methods, they're useful sometimes in an auxiliary role, right? So like not in the explanatory model, but maybe sometimes it's a matter of like, how do I get the right sample that's really about the things I want? Was I using the right keywords? I feel more comfortable saying, proofs in the pudding, face validity, I got some things that are about the thing I cared about. I don't need to teach you about, I believe the model that used deep learning to find the right ones. I'm gonna do some explanatory modeling on the things that I found, but I think that auxiliary role is why I didn't focus on deep learning, and they're like, that's the hot new thing. If I learn deep learning, I can ask the machine, and the machine will tell me my substantive answer.
Anyone else wants to jump in?
Yeah. So I've gotten this question many times before, like, and the, yeah. No, we had, like, the most attended panel I ever was on was at Midwest, like, 8 years ago, and it was theory versus big data versus, it was like causal inference, rational choice, and big data. And
It's
they
the
had
same
two
thing,
of
yeah.
us for, like, each of those things, and it was supposed to be this big debate. And I made a similar point to what I want to make right now, which is that, I won't get into the causal inference part of it, but, like, in terms of what you guys have said, prediction versus explanation, I actually feel like, and I might be wrong on this, but I actually feel like computational social science has really made, like, a nice step of showing, like, how these things can be brought together really nicely, because most of the time when we're using machine learning, we're using it to, well, for, not most of the time, but for a lot of the time where we're using it, we're essentially using it to create variables we wouldn't be able to create otherwise. But then we take those variables and we put them into a statistical model the same way we would other variables if we had created them, you know, I just had some statistical agency give it to me, or I got the results of a survey. So when I think about this, I don't think of political science, the political scientists' use of machine learning as primarily being, I want to write a model that will predict the outcome of the election. There are certainly people who do this, right? There's that team in Milan who's been doing those, like, voices from the blog, where they are literally trying to use social media data to predict election outcomes. But that's actually a very small part of the field, right? And whereas
We call it parlor tricks. It's a side hobby, right?
yeah, I mean, I don't think it's like what it's mainly used for. It's mainly used for, like, we want to understand, we have a theory, or not a theory, in this case it was a pure descriptive paper. Like, the entire media said that hate speech went up when Trump entered the election, and it went up over the course of the election. And we literally wanted to know if that was right or not. So we needed a variable that measured hate speech over time so that we could have 720 days of things. And that, like, that's what we used our machine learning for, was to actually create a variable that in other days we would have gotten out of a survey, or we would have gotten out of statistical, you know, from a state statistical office, like earlier in my career, like that's where I got my variables from. So, I mean, in that sense, I think they can be, the prediction versus explanation doesn't have to be a false dichotomy, and I don't actually think it captures much of what's going on. That being said, like, I occasionally go to a presentation from a computer scientist, and they're like, and here's what we got, and you have somebody say, like, well, you know, we have theoretical models about why that outcome might happen. What does this tell us about the theoretical model? And the computer scientist says, well, I don't care, because if your theoretical model doesn't predict the correct outcome, right, why do I care about your theoretical model? So I've seen people's heads explode over that. Like, and I definitely, like, so it's a real thing. I'm not saying, like, it's not a thing that you shouldn't be including in here, but, like, I actually think we have some, our field shows a way that you can bring these things together kind of nicely. And we super care about the prediction, because the same way I used to care about whether data I was getting out of Poland in the 1990s was actually describing reality. Like, I wanted to, you know, we don't like it when we find the Hungarians announced they were making up economic data. It's the same thing. We don't want the machine learning to be bad, because then our models have bad data in it, whether it's humans who are botching the data deliberately or not deliberately, or it's machines that are botching the data. We still want to we want to believe in the quality of the data that we bring to our analyses. So that was my take on this one.
I think that I would summarize that point by saying, and I think I'm borrowing, I don't know if Hannah Wallach at Microsoft is still pushing this line, but basically the idea that we can use NLP and machine learning as measurement tools. And that measurement is it's essentially prediction. It's not trying to give explanations of things, creating auxiliary variables, measuring the data, and there's lots of ways to do it. There's lots of different levels of human involvement at different phases in that. But essentially, if you box it in and say, these are ways to measure, they're sort of new alternatives to survey methods or whatever else you had before, that feels much more modest and mostly correct.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think it's this modesty that is the common through line. It's the modesty that is the common through line that is helping, I think, square each of these, not square them, but these debates. It doesn't feel like a debate to me, like Jen said, right? I think people recognize in this space that there are, in some cases, different goals, like with Jen and her friend, right? But there's still information, and yet I think that there's, I think I want us to not lose track of the fact that it's not just that computational text analysis has helped social scientists ask the same kinds of questions that we've always asked, but faster and more efficiently. It's that it's allowed us to ask questions that we never would have been able to ask before. So I use Jen's, some of her work on Chinese censorship as a good example for my students of how, I mean, we just would never know how Chinese censorship worked without these methods, right? And it's not something that you could have done at a manual scale. You just couldn't have done it, right? So we couldn't have asked that question. And so there's this lovely feedback loop where that's going to help, right, us to refine our models and build new mental models and to ask new questions that is going to fuel into the data. Mostly I want to make sure I'm not coming across as a sourpuss.
No, nothing to worry about there. So given that we're now in a later phase of the panel, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, and then from there we'll move on to sort of a, I guess you could call it a CV of failures type of thing, where we talk about, you know, what's the difficulties that people have experienced, the successes along the way, I guess, too.
We talked about computer science, we talked about social science.
Mm-hmm.
I'm situated in the communication department where the office is next to me filled with people who do critical, cultural, rhetorical analysis from before I was born even. And I find that they have a lot of tests, and it relates, I think, to what I heard about. You have 1.5 billion texts, so you cannot analyze them qualitatively. I think
By hand, not qualitatively.
By hand
Yeah.
or qualitatively. I think you can, what they need and what they can use in our tools is some kind, for example, of clustering or guiding them. So I know a lot of humanities-oriented methods can actually make use of these computational methods just as a way to, for data reduction, basically. And then instead of using scaling, basically, what you do is you let them sit on these buckets of data you collected, and then they can look at it. So I think my general question is, where do humanities-oriented research factors into this relationship between computer science and social science?
Oh.
That's a good question. I actually think that one thing that I'm suggesting more and more, and I'm trying to follow more and more in my life, is seeing what good work is being done in digital humanities, and that's a big umbrella. But there's some like Jockers, his name Jockers, who wrote macro analysis and has like a book for like studying literature using R and had used some Python before. I actually think, and this actually connects a bit to the earlier question about when you use qualitative or when you use automated, let's say, and not automated, however, it's kind of empirical, old school. My sort of working framework or paradigm is, I think about sort of the, I think originally thought about like Luke Skywalker in Star Wars using his eyes versus using the Force, but maybe a better metaphor is like a pilot who has all these automated systems and also their eyes to look out, and they're using these tools, I don't, in a kind of I wouldn't say seamless, but there's times where it's like, uh-oh, we're getting a warning, oh no, it must be malfunctioning, and because I'm seeing something that doesn't mean what this alarm says, or sometimes I can't see things because of the clouds, I better go back into my automated systems and use them together. I think that similarly, kind of, at least for me, and this is something that I see some in digital humanities doing a little bit more because they're comfortable with being interpretive, or being critical, asking these kind of rich questions that are not always, don't have necessarily the cloak of like big science. I think that's a helpful way of thinking about using tools, about having, in the same ways that we integrate cell phones and other things into our lives, being able to use tools and models and not, there was a question I think that we didn't quite ask that we were supposed to think about, which is like, how close are we to everything automated?
Yeah.
Hopefully never. Hopefully never, because I think that there's a tendency, and this is a little bit of the sort of scientism, to sort of misassociate, to think of things that are arbitrary as if they're like objective and scientific, and that like it's easy to sort of say, I'm going to do something that's totally objective and replicable. In fact, I'm going to flip a coin on my computer using a set seed, and if you do flip the coin too, you're going to get the same thing, and it has nothing to do with maybe the, I can say if I get a 1 instead of a 0, I'm going to say, I found that the moon is made of cheese, right? And I'm like, oh, I'm being so objective, right? That's an extreme version, but I think that there is this tendency to believe like replicability, and if we do it arbitrarily, if I can prove I didn't make any subjective judgments, that must be good inherently. And I'm hoping that like one thing we can kind of learn from humanities is that's not always the right tack.
Right.
I would also just,
Please.
yeah,
Go
so at
ahead.
Stanford, there are a lot of, there are big digital humanities labs that are using a lot of these methods, and you see folks in comparative literature, English, using these methods. And I think if we, going back to what Noah was saying about, this is a measurement tool, another way to think about it is, this is a way of operationalizing concepts related to the research questions that we have. If we think about it as a way of operationalization or measurement, then it can be used for social science, this kind of social scientific inquiry. It can be used for digital humanities, because what it's doing is measuring. And I think, as Amber has said, it allows us to measure things that previously we couldn't measure very well. Maybe we theorize about them, but we couldn't measure it directly. But just as any measurement tool, it has shortcomings. Survey-based methods, there's certain questions that can't address. There's certain biases and errors that are generated with it. Same, I think, with these tools. So maybe that's the way to think about it. It's a way of measuring operationalization. It's not the research design, and it's not the research question. We still have to use subject expertise to come up with theories, to come up with questions, and to design research, whether it's descriptive or causal, to answer those questions. But then now we have this new tool that allows us to understand or measure phenomena that we weren't able to before.
Thank you.
So I did some work. One of my PhD students, David Beman, is essentially a digital humanities scholar, and so I got to dip my toes into this when he was a student. And in my experience, I think Jen's basically right. I think that there's less of a sense of like, it's important in computational social science, you always have to validate those measures and show that they're actually doing the thing you want, and it's just harder to do that in the digital humanities because there isn't a ground truth. Like you can't go to your English professor and say, what is actually the right answer, right? It's not like that. So there were bigger divides. David is brilliant and had his feet in both worlds, so it was great for him. For me, it was more challenging to find points of connection with that world. But otherwise, I think it was very, very similar to my experience talking to social scientists.
So we have 15 minutes left, and we would like to start with what hasn't really worked, the failures, quote unquote. Hopefully to have a little bit of irony and end up on a funny note, laughable one. So who wants to start? All successful people. I have plenty of failures in this field, so.
So yesterday I got news that my second political science article has been published. So after 15 years.
Congratulations.
Quite a failure, Noah.
Big
Quite a failure.
In your weird journal world, I joke that it only took us half a political science year to get this work done, because a political science year is equal to roughly 8 human years. So I mean, despite wonderful collaborators, I found it incredibly challenging to do work in political science that political scientists will recognize and get it published. I don't need to, okay? I have tenure, I'm a full professor. I don't need any of this, but I have these PhD students, and unlike in political science, we have a sense of responsibility towards our students that we mentor them and we help them with careers. I have a lot more to say about that. But I learned that through really interesting ways. The culture of mentoring is extremely different in computer science. But I have these people, and I feel some responsibility to them. They need to publish. And so every time I had a political science-oriented, computational science, social science-oriented PhD student, we had to come up with a plan where, yes, maybe we were collaborating with someone like Amber or Justin on something substantive that would eventually, maybe, God willing,
And dog ears.
if we make the right sacrifices to the gods, will get published there. At the same time, we have to take care of their careers, and they need to be publishing in worlds that in forums that will be understood by people who might want to hire them. And so in some sense, it was like, I feel like some of them, like Dallas kind of did 2 PhD, not quite exactly, but it was like a huge amount of extra work and strategizing, which will serve those people well in their future careers, because they know how to juggle in ways nobody else does. But man, was it frustrating. And like I just don't understand this difference in publication style and the process and the quality of the reviews and the kind of stuff you see in the reviews. It's like, why do you all put yourselves through this?
Where are you going to be published? Now I'm curious.
We had like a lot more rejections.
Well,
So many rejections.
I'll add on to that, I think that the one way of phrasing that failure, it's not a failure, but that, let's take your student Dallas, right? Dallas graduated with a PhD in computer science, but it took him arguably longer, had he just focused on computer science and not tried to dabble in this world, he probably would have published more, right? He might have gone faster.
He wouldn't have had to go to that backwater Stanford to do a postdoc.
There we go, yeah, exactly, right. And so, he was able to ask questions that he wouldn't have been able to ask otherwise, but I do think that you're bringing up a good point that it's not about failure, but there are these resource restrictions, and there are two kinds of resource restrictions if we want to think about it that way. One is money, right? So I'm at a terribly underfunded state university, and I love it and it's lovely. But what this means is that I have to rely exclusively on external grants. There's no internal money, right? And so that means that I need to be cautious about which kind of big projects I take on, because if I don't have that external money, that I can't take it on, and importantly, I shouldn't set my grad students in that direction because I take care of my grad students. And so that's one resource constraint. The other one is the publication incentives, right? And so for my grad students, right, I want to put them on track to be able to publish enough so that they're competitive on the academic market. But because I rely exclusively on external grants, right, we don't have the kind of money to be able to necessarily be able to ensure that they're going to be able to buy, the fire hose of Twitter data or whatever, right? And so we have to be cautious about what kinds of projects they're going to take on, including, right, this fact that in the publication world, if you're doing the kind of gold standard work, right, Josh, that you're doing, then you should be able to get it published, right? And yet, political scientists and computer scientists, I think in general, they're still not sure how to handle these kinds of publications, right? And so it's riskier in some sense than it would have been, publishing using ANES public opinion data, right?
I would say structurally, at least at Stanford, but also I think externally, there's a lot of money for interdisciplinary collaboration
That
and
sounds
research.
nice.
but also NSF too. They want you to collaborate across universities or across disciplines. I'm in a communication department, which is inherently interdisciplinary. But because of those grants, I've collaborated with computer scientists, and that's resulted in one CS proceedings publication. But I think, and not more, because people are interested in different things. I want to answer a social science question, and 99% of the time, that's not going to push research frontiers in computer science. Maybe 99.9% of the time, it's not going to. And so the interests intrinsically, I think, diverge. And so if you have to publish together, that's my one experience, is that I don't feel like we advance anything in terms of knowledge on the social science side, and I'm sure my CS colleagues didn't feel like we advance anything on the CS side. But we published something, and the grad student who's a first author, that was good for her, and it didn't take super long. I think on the social science side, what we did do was really confirm a result that others had seen, and I think that's valuable, but I think from a social science publication or political science publication perspective, that's not rewarded. Like, you need something new. And so the incentives, again, I think are somewhat different. One thing I want to highlight is that I wonder if for PhD students to do this work, they need to actually have more of that lab structure. my department is lab-based because it's influenced by psych and HCI, and so students are funded by faculty, and it sounds like I know for Josh's lab and Amber, what you're saying, that sounds similar, because you do need those economies of scale to implement the projects and to shield PhD students from the uncertainties given the investment that is needed sometimes to carry out these projects.
Any failures, or Justin?
My CV of failures is just my CV. I mean, in some ways, it's a joke, but in some ways, some of it's like what Noah said. It's, that thing that I got published, 8 years after I started writing it, had rejected multiple times, and then, maybe wasn't happy with. I think sometimes it makes it stronger, and sometimes you kind of have to make a lot of, I don't know. You have to pitch it in a different way, and it's not what it started out. I think also because it's a process, and because of I'm just thinking about, we might develop a method that is a little bit better than maybe what was available in the past. But then someone writes to you, and so it's published, and someone's like, I want to use your method, and you're like, I don't know, maybe I'm just, I'm like, I wouldn't use that. I don't think it's quite there yet, And it's too bad, because I think part of that is I think about my don't know much about the sort of wild world of research in biology, but my father-in-law worked on trying to come up with some he was doing transplantation and diabetes and stuff, and it was there was a sort of long-term thing he wanted to solve that he never got to, right? But he still was able to maintain a career. It was he published some little paper, and they're like, okay, here's why this might be promising, and what do they call it, bench science or something, just sort of, right? I don't think we have that as much. It's sort of well, what's the big thing? And then some of the reviewers are instead of saying, that's provocative, this should get a wider audience, it's you haven't convinced me that you're right, and that you've solved the thing, and and so I think that can hurt us, because I think in that other world I might have been that paper, here's the main thing, and here's why it was a little bit better. It's not, that's the method now, but I don't know. I think we've made progress in that direction, but I think it can be really hard, and that's why I don't think of anything that I do as this is a success now. It's just kind of, that was the best. That's what got us to a point where we could get someone to publish it, and now what can we do to improve on it?
Josh, you close the panel with whatever failure or success, whichever way you want to tweak it.
Okay, all right. Okay, so let me say a few things quickly. The first is, a lot of these things that people are bringing up here, it sounds like there are general challenges around interdisciplinary collaboration. And there is this weird tension right now, because you're absolutely right. Deans love interdisciplinary collaboration. The NSF seems to love interdisciplinary collaboration. So there's all these incentives to do interdisciplinary collaboration. But there are really all these serious challenges around it. And for those of you who are interested, so about 3 years ago, it was before the pandemic, so I don't know how many years was in political science time, right? But I co-chaired something for a Minerva thing where they do these future directions in blank, and we did future directions in social science research, and got a lot of really good people together, and basically they wanted us to focus on interdisciplinary research involving social scientists. And so there's way more in there than we could possibly talk about today, but it's a good publication that lays out a lot of these things. I'll just say one thing that I have found particularly tough is that, pick on one thing of that, is that having set up a lab 10 years ago in political science at a time when there really weren't labs, and I had no idea how to set up a lab. I didn't know anything about labs, and so, but one of the people who it was an interdisciplinary lab, and one of the people was a biologist. He was a computational biologist who had real expertise in networks, and it really turbocharged what we were able to do on network science and taught us all about machine learning. But he also was like, well, this is the way you do it in a lab around publications. You use this first author model where the student or the PhD, the postdoc who's led the thing is the first author. Then if you have people in the lab who've contributed, like if you use some code that was delivered from a different project, you put them on as the middle author, and the PIs of the lab are on as the last authors. And we had a lot of back and forth about that. We're like, oh no, we do names in alphabetical order, and what these things mean. And we eventually settled in on this, which is the way that labs do it. And that is not the way that political scientists do it. Now there's more people starting to do it that way, but we have in biology, and I remember we had some big discussions about solo authored things by graduate students, and in like the concept of solo authored graduate student work in biology was just like foreign. Like, well, how could you do it if you're a graduate student? You don't have the grants to do these sorts of things. We have these economies of scale. But if you have but a real failure is that I feel like I've had students who say to me after they leave my lab, I would love to keep working on these projects, but I have been told by my colleagues I cannot co-author anything with you until I have tenure. And that just seems like a knowledge loss. Like these students are not getting, and I have other students who don't feel that way at all, and maybe they're shooting themselves in the foot towards tenure. I don't know, most states, who knows what the actual state of the world is. But that to me is like, we are just not getting something right here because there's research that's not getting done. People are either not getting the right credit for things, and this seems like something that the sciences have solved long ago, and that the social sciences doesn't know how to do it. So that's a failure thing. Then there's journals, and I'll just note two things about journals. I have a whole list of these things, but I want to say two things right now in closing here. One, or I'll say three really quickly. One, a lot of computational social science is descriptive. When we started in this ballgame, we weren't even trying to publish in political science journals because everything was about causality. Now, since then, the pendulum has swung back a little bit. There is some understanding that maybe there are some descriptive things we need to know about the world. If you think the whole world is changing, it might be nice to be able to describe some of it. And we have started doing a lot more trying to figure out ways to do more causal research, like the one I was talking about the influence of the bots, or doing more experiments and stuff like that. But like, I think that was a really big barrier and a really weird thing to be watching because like, we're like, oh, well, we can't send this to a second-tier political science journal, but maybe science will publish it, right? Like, it just seemed like a very weird world to be in, where the biggest journals in the entire field of research thought that this was interesting research in political science, didn't it? And that is far from solved, although it's slightly better. And the second thing is that like, I just think like the computational social sciences for these fields like social media and politics, where like people really want to know the impact of like algorithms on things. Algorithms change all the time, right? Like we really need to do replication research in this domain of digital politics. It needs to be done a lot, and there is no incentive to do it in journals. It is really a massive problem. Like science advances through replication. And especially in these fast-moving fields, like in political science years, we're going to publish a big article about 2016. It's great, it shows we're really good researchers. Like, if we try to replicate, I keep trying to do this, like we do a study, then we try to replicate it. People are like, well, that's not new, we can't publish it, And so this is just a massive failure. I think this is a problem. We know how science works, we know how good science is done, and the journal model of it, especially in political science, but in other places too, is just not aligned with it. I don't know how we solve this, but this is a real problem because especially, and we just expect in political science, we expect every graduate student to have a brand new theory about how the world works that they've proven conclusively while they were doing their PhD. It's just ridiculous.
Well, otherwise it's an applied PhD who has no value, right? So it's like.
And then the final thing I want to just point out, say the last thing, because you guys did ask about replication, is I think there is a real tension developing that no one is paying attention to, except when I try to scream about it on Twitter, and people say there's a real tension developing between pre-registration, which is supposed to have you not do p-hacking, and you say I'm going to test these 7 things, and I'm going to multiple hypothesis correct for these 7 things. And the style of reviewing in political science is to show how smart you are by telling people to test for 27 other things that they didn't think to test for. And the style of getting published in political science is to do everything the reviewer says.
Yeah.
What does that mean for multiple hypothesis correction? We have no answer for this. It is pre-registration versus our reviewing system. Reviews are based on telling the journal, the people who wrote the article, they didn't do it correctly and they should go back and do it the way you thought they should do it. And pre-registration is literally based on saying, we are going to bind our hands and do it this way so that we don't p-hack. And I think that is also a big, big problem right now that is coming down the horizon, that it's Wild West in terms of pre-registration in the political science still, but like, we just don't have an answer for that. So that's another thing that I'm finding very frustrating right now, how to figure out how to deal with that.
Well, thank you very much. We've had 5 luminaries share very exciting thoughts on the direction of the field. And it's given excellent starting points for a year's worth of discussion. and I think it might actually take a year to get through all of the ones that you've made. They're all absolutely wonderful. So would everyone please thank me in joining Jen, Josh, Noah, Amber, and Justin.